thank you very much for the invitation and congratulations on the excellent initiative you have organized here. So I start immediately. So briefly, I want to start first with a general introduction because you have in former Yugoslavia, I think it's probably one of the countries where there's still most consciousness or knowledge that something like workers' control or self-management existed somehow. Otherwise, it's, but even here, it's a story that is not often told completely. And I think it's very important when we talked about this morning in the workshop, I think it's very important to have some kind of public debate and also get to workers about the how and why it failed. Because otherwise, if there's just the feeling that it failed and just the nostalgic remembrance that somehow it was nice but it failed, people won't try it again. But if it's clearer to them why it failed and for which reasons, then you obviously can propose it again and engage in a different way. Generally, like I said, it's something that like occupations by workers, takeovers of workplaces in order to produce under workers' control is something that happened throughout the history of labor, of work in working for others. In fact, we find even a little footnote in Engels' text where he says that after the crisis of the 1840s in a factory he knows in northern England that went bankrupt, the workers took over the factory and are paying now a salary to the director to still be there as director to help them to organize the whole factory on their own. So we see it's an old thing, and it has been repeating throughout history and in different countries and places all over. We can take any kind of crisis we can imagine, from political crisis to economic crisis to any kind of revolution, from democratic revolutions to socialist revolutions to anti-colonial struggles. We always have this figure appearing of workers taking over workplaces and managing them on their own. We can start and talk about obviously all the different socialist revolutions at the beginning of the 20th century that all had, from like the Russian Revolution to Austria, Hungary, Spain in the 30s, Italy in the early 20th century, all over we had like these massive takeovers of factories, building of workers' council, etc. But also after the war, for example, after the Second World War, we had massive takeovers and factories under worker control. The whole South France, for example, the whole industries in the south of France were taken over by workers and run under workers' control in 44, 45, etc., simply because they didn't trust in the capitalists that they would be able or would have any interest in restarting production, and they didn't, in effect. So the workers had to do it. Same thing in Japan, for example, when in Japan everything broke down after the Second World War, the capitalists had no interest in restart production. It was for them easier, and they would gain more money by just like importing or doing other things. So it was the workers that took over, like from steel plants to ship building places and etc. It was the workers that organized the production in Japan for like 2-3 years in a lot of the main factories. In fact, the first influence came even from mining, and it was like the Korean slave laborers that they had during the Second World War that started the struggles in the mines and then went over to some kind of control of the mines. We have again the situation in the different anti-colonial and national liberation wars, be it Algeria, like in the early 60s, where then the people took over the plantations that were left by the French people, or in Indonesia, where after the independence in 46, 47, I think, for example, the whole national train system was taken over and run during 2 years by the workers on their own. The whole, like doing everything from the plants to the maintenance of the trains. Same thing to the tea plantations that they had left in there. It happens again in the 60s in political upheaval, where like leftist forces are strong, so workers take over factories and occupy them in order to produce under their control. It happened then again in crisis like when neoliberalism kicks in the late 70s, in the early 80s. You have as a struggle against neoliberalism the same thing. Workers take over their plants and factories and start producing on their own, or start even like the case of the British case of the arms industry, where the workers occupied and even started proposing alternative production and having even like community workshops to develop ideas about what useful societal useful production could be and what they could produce. In Canada, the National Phone Company was taken over in '81 by the workers, 95% women, and they run for 8 months the National Phone Company under workers' control as a protest against all kinds of cuts and downsizing that they wanted. And we can continue like that with loads and loads of examples, how they always kicked in again. And it's not that they've been reading about other councils or workers' occupations and then they said, oh, it's a good idea, we'll do it as well. It was something that like came as an impulse from. So there is obviously some kind of element that brings workers to, at a certain point, to first of all recognize that they know how to manage the companies that they work for, and second, to be convinced at a certain breaking point that they can do it better, and the owners, the capitalists, the state, or whoever. Because we had the same thing. I mean, Yugoslavia was a very special situation, but even here you had internal struggles in different self-managed factories about the quality of the self-management, because most of the times it was self-managed by the party and not by the workers, and or by bureaucrats from the party sent over. But you had the same thing in all kinds of other socialist countries. I mean, from the uprisings in Hungary to Czechoslovakia, one element was always takeover of factories, and the factories were run by the workers on their own. In the conflicts in Poland in the early 80s, same thing. Solidarność had two wings, one right-wing neoliberal and one very social revolutionary wing that was more situated in the south, and they took over factories and had them under workers' control working. So we see that happens all over, and it happened again and again. But no one is telling these stories, because obviously the stories are mainly told by parties, by unions, by governments, and by capitalists. And obviously none of these entities has an interest to tell a story where workers don't need any of these four entities to be working and have a company functioning. We have then, what becomes more known is like with the wave that starts with the Argentinian crisis around 2000, 2001, 2002, where we have massive factory takeovers, and the factories are producing under workers' control, and it spreads from Argentina, the example, and factories are occupied in Brazil and in Uruguay, and then in the years later in Venezuela, and single factories also, a few, 2 or 3 in Colombia, and a few in Mexico, 3 or 4, and 1 in Panama, or I don't know, but like the main countries were Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Venezuela. It takes up again in this crisis, and from 2009 to now, we have 60 new companies that are producing under workers' control in Argentina. Interesting, the thing spreads also to companies that usually are not like the ideal place to organize people. Restaurants, which is like you have usually high fluctuation of workers, or workers are there for the whole life, so that's a semi-familiar situation, what makes obviously organizing and conflict much more difficult. But we have several restaurants and even 2 fast food restaurants, which is very interesting in Buenos Aires, that when they close down, the workers take them over and they're running them now under workers' control. Very interesting case because it's not only that the high fluctuation, but in this case it's very young, precarious, and mainly even immigrant workers from Bolivia or other places that were working in these fast food restaurants. But the whole thing of the occupations and recuperations has become some kind of part of the patrimony, of the treasure that workers in Argentina have as variety of struggles in their repertoire. So it was even for these young kids working their shifts in the fast food stores, when they got kicked out and the shop was closed, it was for them one option to say, okay, we'll just occupy and run it on our own. And then they approached the restaurants and different other places that they knew were occupied and asked them for help. So we have nowadays about 360 companies that are under workers' control in Argentina. It's about 69 in Brazil, about 24 in Uruguay, and about 100 in Venezuela, which the countries have very different conditions, and also the factories, their operations. So in Argentina we have a situation where there's this broad network and they support each other, and it's very, very much linked to other movements, to communities, and less to unions. Only very few unions supported in Argentina, like a metal worker union on the coast started working with recuperations a little bit, but it's very few, and it's mainly like the self-organized networks and the political and the other movements that supported it. In Brazil, there has been a much stronger support from some unions in different sectors and less contact with movements. But it's also like the state policies in Brazil situate the recuperated workplace in the Ministry of Work, what shows you what the logic is. For them, it's not a productive industry, but it's some kind of, okay, we have less jobless people if they work in these recuperated workplaces. While in Venezuela, Uruguay, and Argentina, they're situated in the Ministry of Industries because it's considered a productive business or productive industry. In Uruguay, they have a very strong support by the unions, but because the unions in Uruguay have been working historically since the 1940s with the cooperative movement. So which is not the case in most countries of the world, where unions consider cooperatives like bourgeois or petit capitalists or whatever, but in Uruguay there has always been this strong connection between the unions and cooperatives and solidarity economy, what led to the fact that many of the cooperatives are really like workers' cooperatives with a different orientation and different functioning than they have in Argentina or in Italy, where meanwhile cooperatives are at the head of exploitation, you can say, because the laws for cooperatives allow you to have workers you don't have to pay the national contract, and etc. So the whole logistics sector in Italy, for example, is organized in cooperatives. Like, that's why Italy has most of the logistics of Europe, like the logistics centers of IKEA and of many other big players in Europe are all in Italy. They're all in the former communist regions of Italy, and they're all based on the former communist cooperatives, which have 96% immigrant workers that are paid a few euros an hour, much, much less than any national contract or working condition, and they have to pay 4,000 euros to get into the cooperative first. And so they had even, like, during the 2 years, it was a field of struggle. I mean, they had several strikes in the logistics sectors of the workers striking against their supposed own cooperatives. So just to see what way cooperatives can take if it's not, if you just follow the law, you just have to do one meeting a year and elect the boss, and that's it. There's not a big difference with any other company. But on the other hand, also all recuperated factories are also cooperative, because the law doesn't give you any other frame for a collective management. So then simply the concept cooperative doesn't say a lot or anything. We have always to look how they really function. What are the differences in Venezuela? The recuperations had, first they were more or less ignored by the state, and then at a certain point the state started to intervene massively, and often simply expropriate or nationalize the occupied companies with the idea to hand them over to the workers when the workers are ready. The problem is that bureaucracy usually never considers the workers ready for anything, so it's again a struggle then often between the workers and the administration from the government to really control these places. But it had also what on the first hand seems, oh wow, cool, the government is totally on your side and they nationalize immediately, is not necessarily positive. Because in many cases the workers didn't even have the time to really consolidate a collective and to really be clear what they want and how they're going to work, because the state intervention was so fast that they didn't come to form this collective that obviously forms in the struggle during the occupation when you start like talking about how you're going to manage this. So they were also not able in many cases to fight back then the bureaucratic administration put in by the state. And it's interesting because then I want to touch this question of the law, because we often have the tendency to think that laws can solve a lot of things. And we have in all these countries, especially in Venezuela it's more a proceeding, but in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, at a certain point, they made laws about these recuperations, how they have to be handled to legalize them. The consequence was that in Brazil, since they made the law like 8 years ago or something, there hasn't been one new recuperation since the law is in effect. In Uruguay, same thing. Since the law is in effect, not one new recuperation. And in Argentina, after the law came into effect, the recuperations went down a lot, and the time they needed from occupation to legalization doubled. So why all that? Okay, because the problem is we have to consider a recuperation not only a political or not only an economic process, but also political and a social process. But this side becomes invisible the moment we follow only the law. Because what is before, like the occupation, the demonstration, being on the street, convincing other people, having leaflets, having political discussions, is suddenly turned into a simple debate about law procedures and bureaucratic procedures, how you get the legalization. So you don't have the public attention. Your occupation or your struggle is not anymore an example for others, workers that might be in a similar situation, and then get the idea to pick up the struggle because they see the struggle, because they don't see it anymore if it's just going to the ministry and exchanging papers. So, so the original intention that they had, because they didn't have the bad intention to stop the recuperations, they just thought, like many people think, and I also thought, and whatever, that you make a law and it makes everything easier and better, and it didn't. So we have to think about when we're in this conflict, if it really makes sense, for example, to push for a law or not. Before the law existed, you needed the mobilization, you put up the pressure, and then the regional or national parliament decides about the expropriation for this urgent case, etc., and does it. But you have also built a public debate, a public consciousness, a public intervention, etc. And that's the important thing about them. Going back to the history, as I said, that we saw that throughout history we had these examples of workers' recuperations. But there's one big difference today, that in other times it was practically always out of an offensive of workers' struggle or the left. So obviously, like in the revolutions or in a system that says it's socialist, and then the workers said, yes, but you say the workers are the ones controlling, but we're not, so we take it and control it. Or in when neoliberalism kicks in, the unions are still strong, and the workers' struggle is still strong, so they do it out of a situation of strength that they occupy and take over in this attack. The occupations and recuperations since the crisis 2000-2001, and now again in this crisis, are out of a defensive situation, out of a weakness of the unions that are not able anymore to counter-arrest the changes that you have. And out of this defensive situation, it's the only offensive form of struggle that has been developed up to now, that gives the workers the chance to go into offensive, to not be at the mercy of the unions, of the state, of whatever, obviously to risk with no guarantee to win. But it's something completely different if you can go into the offensive and lead this struggle. And so we have about 60 new recuperations in Argentina during this time, and a few in Europe. There are like 2 in France, at least 2 in Italy, 1 in Istanbul, and 1 in Greece. There are many more that are so-called workers' buyouts, where like they want to close, so the workers buy the shares, etc. I don't count them because I think that the most important thing is the social process that is part of these recuperations, and not the simple fact to change the number of owners, because if you continue working in the same way, it doesn't really make a difference if you have 1 owner or 20 or 100, or if you're a company at the stock market with 2 million shares. I mean, if you don't decide and you're not part of it, and if you don't have equal conditions, and that's what happens with many of the workers' buyouts, that then, like there's one case of they produce like tape to tape things in Italy, and there they did this workers' buyout, and it's like 50% foreign investor and 50% is workers' shares, but the employees have twice as much shares as the workers because they had more money. That's a democratization of capitalism, but it's not a recuperation, like I would say. But there are also cases of buyouts that have been managed in a different way, and from their functioning can be counted as recuperations, with a democratic functioning, with equal rights and equal voice for everyone, with decisions taken collectively in assemblies, etc. And it's not the fact that the workers put money to buy something, because most of the conflicts end up that the workers have to put the money that the business still owns them to buy out the business somehow. But the question is, if you have a struggle, a conflict, and then this is the result, or if it's simply economic transaction where, okay, I want to close, you want to buy it? Yes, I want to buy it, boom, done. So that's not a recuperation. And I think that because especially in Spain and in Italy, the press is pushing very much these workers' buyouts and telling everyone this is the Argentinian example. This is like in Argentina. It's not, but they do it. And I think sometimes is that they probably fear that the other example might be more interesting for workers. So they try to sell them that as the most radical and best option ever. But like I said, there are also workers' buyouts that function differently. There's, for example, the biggest beer producer in Messina, Sicily, was closed down, and the workers got together and did a campaign in the city to, like, under the flag, that Messina should maintain its own locally produced and sold beer, and raised money in the city to buy the thing, build a cooperative, and work as a cooperative and produce beer. And that's what they do now. It's a workers' buyout, but it was connected to a social mobilization, to a struggle, to the thing that they have all equal rights and equal shares, and it's not shares that they can sell. I think that's the next important point, that what I call recuperations, it's people don't have individual shares. You have a voice as long as you work there, and once you don't have it anymore, and you don't have any share you can take home, and you can't sell it, and you can't give it to anyone. It's like, it's some kind of social property, you know? Why do I say it's a social process more than an economic process? Because usually everything changes in these factories. I mean, they produce new values in every sense, from social relations that change. So obviously people, when they're in a struggle, they have to rely on each other. So you get to know people differently. You get to build different solidarity ties. You get to know the families. You get to, usually the factories that are successful, win struggles, and can maintain themselves, have strong ties with communities around them or with other movements, and have an exchange and support with that. I think it's interesting compared to simple cooperatives, because a simple cooperative is, if it's not now like some cases here in Yugoslavia where they turned certain companies into cooperatives, but usually it's like people come together that want to be a cooperative. If you close down a factory, it's not that they're all people that want to recuperate the factory because they're all comrades and convinced that everyone should be equal and have an equal say. You have a situation where one might be a right-winger and the other one is not interested at all in politics, and the other one was like licking the butt of the factory director like last month still, and etc. So you have like these, and that's the interesting thing. These people now have to get together and collectively build something new out of the situation they are in, and that's the transformative potential that these recuperations have. Because obviously these people interact also with their families and with other people, and it's completely different than if a bunch of people just come together because they always wanted to work in a cooperative, which is perfectly fine. I mean, I also prefer to work in a cooperative and without a boss than with a boss, but the transformatory potential of a recuperation is something totally different than from a simple cooperative. We can see how these social relations change in the sense that questions like time and engagement get a different value. I mean, like for example, there's been in factories in Venezuela where they decided, okay, that the people that still have to do their primary school work only 6 hours a day and have the rest to go to primary school. The ones that still have to finish secondary school work 7 hours, and the ones that don't have to finish any school work 8 hours. It was the decision in the factory to do it like that, to give certain people the possibility to finish or to do their advance further with their education. There are many factories in Argentina that keep, for example, 1 day a month is for mobilization to support other struggles. Like it's part of the work. And so every week, like a certain number of people goes for 1 day and supports a different struggle, and it's part of their daily work. The assemblies and discussion are also part of the work time. So you have all these things that are changing. The value you give obviously to the things you produce, but also to the raw material. I mean, Zanon, very well known, for example, the ceramics factory in Argentina. They get the clay they use to produce the ceramics from close to the place they live, from a Mapuche territory. The former owner never paid anything. They decided they're going to pay the Mapuche. They got into a relation with them, and then the Mapuche started designing they produced tiles, and they started making different Mapuche designs for the tiles that Sanon is selling, for example, and they started a cooperation on that. So you get a different relationship around the value. So obviously every capitalist would have gone on not paying the clay to the Mapuche, or because that's the logic, but they integrated that and becomes a different value. The factory Viome in Greece used to produce chemical production materials. They were closed down. They occupied. First, they occupied just to get their money back, the money that the owner would owe them. And it was interesting because one thing you have to keep in mind, it doesn't matter how much you learn and study about recuperated factories. It doesn't matter how many you visit and study and you know about them. And I've probably seen, 100 or more in my life. I can't convince any worker of taking over a factory or recuperated or a company or whatever. Only a worker can do that is also in, and that has a complete experience. So you should never think that even if you spend half your life reading and researching and working on these things, that you can go to the next workers' conflict and convince them that they should take over or recuperate their factory. If you want to do that, you can get in touch. We invite workers from a different occupied factory. They go there, they will be convincing them. That's how we did it in Viome. My partner raised, when she heard the factory is occupied, they want their money back. She raised $4,000 on Facebook, bought 2 tickets for 2 workers in Argentina that are coming out of occupied workplaces, and we sent them to Thessaloniki. And they stayed a week with the workers in Thessaloniki and discussed for them about a week, like about their experiences taking over, who's gonna be your enemy, what's gonna happen, who's gonna fight you, etc., etc. And after a few days of discussion, the workers in Thessaloniki were convinced that they take over the factory and produce on their own instead of just asking for their money back. It was also the experience that they were telling them, you will not get your money back. I mean, that never happens. The workers are always the last. If they get anything, they're the last ones. So I think that these networks are especially important for these things. The conditions of the factories we have in Europe are very, very different. Viome, like I said, they started producing organic cleaners and organic soap. They started building new networks because their idea was, well, on one hand, they didn't have the capital to go on producing the chemical construction materials, but they also didn't want to go on producing them because they thought they would prefer to handle something organic every day than to handle heavy chemical stuff that is obviously also harming them, and to do also something for the environment. At the same time, the question is, do you go into a niche and then sell this stuff very expensive so that it becomes again something exclusive? No. So their thinking is, how can we keep the prices low so that the organic stuff costs the same as any other thing, or maybe just a few cents more. And that's because that's one of the main problems, not only of recuperated factories, but generally of any kind of alternative economy or alternative production or cooperatives, that you end up in the capitalist commodity chain, and then you have to compete with the other producers of the same commodity chain, and that's usually impossible because you obviously don't want to introduce slave labor or anything like that. So you have also to think about how can you build different commodity chains and where can you cut off costs so that you can reduce the cost. And one thing is usually trying to eliminate intermediaries. And that's what they did. They do a lot of direct export with Viome, especially now with the soap to Austria and to Germany. But one of the main one of the main income sources for a long of time was that they were organizing that a few workers from March to October would go directly and sell the stuff on markets, on ferries, and so sell it directly. And that means that you pay for an organic cleaner maybe 10 cents more than you pay for any cheap cleaner in the grocery store. This element to switch to some kind of organic production or a, let's say, ecological thing is very interesting because it comes up a lot. And it comes up in all these European recuperations. The two in Italy have really quite bad conditions in a sense that both cannot go on producing what they produce, and in both the machines were taken out by the owner before that or are not useful anymore. There's one in Rome that used to be a night train repair and construction facility. Obviously, with all the fast tracks that exist in Europe, the night trains don't exist anymore. Or very few. There's one facility in Poland left over that's enough for the night trains that exist. And even if not, it's probably not very easy that you occupy a facility and then the only night train enterprise that exists in Europe that gave up that facility brings the night trains back there to have them repaired. So it won't happen. So you have to reinvent yourself somehow and do something different. In Milan, it was a factory that used to produce the air-conditioned pipes for BMW motor cars. Obviously, I mean, the owner was not, it wasn't even it was a very good factory, working very well, bought up by a Polish investor that just wanted the name, because the name was a worldwide known brand for car parts. So he bought the factory and then he closed it down just to have the name and took out all the machines. Obviously, even keeping the machines, BMW will not buy your workers-controlled air-conditioned pipes from an occupied factory. So you also have to reinvent yourself. And that's what they did, in fact, both. Both have business plans to set up industrial recycling, reuse, and upcycling facilities. And meanwhile, they already started working in these sectors. So in Milan, they first started with reassembling computers and laptops out of parts and repairing and reassembling different household machines and stuff. And then they collected money to make one production hall fit again with air-conditioned system and everything. And they're the recycling industrial wood pallets. They get all the old and broken pallets and whatever, and they put them together into new pallets and sell them. And so there are different elements, but a lot of cultural elements and stuff they're doing also with the community, etc. But the plan is to go on this recycling and to get to the point where they just also can do real industrial recycling. Obviously, you need certain permits and a lot of more money to invest to get there. In Rome, it's the same plan, and what they did is that they have the different workshops that used to be there for the train, like woodworks, ironworks, seeds, and all that. And so they continue working in that. They get old sofas and seats and etc. and rebuild them. Or they repair car seats for people. They do the same thing with some household machines. They do ironworks and they repair wood stuff, and they set up even a carpentry training center for refugees in the factory, and the whole administration building they occupied, and since they don't need it anymore because they coordinate differently, they have co-workings that they set up for precarious workers in the former administration building. So also connecting to the idea how can different work realities we have today get into communication again, because obviously one of the big victories of capitalism is the fragmentation of work that we have, and where people don't have, work used to be for the system, it used to be something that would homogenize people and would automatically bring you to organize yourself and struggle, because you have the same conditions, the same situations, and they always bring you into the same place every day. So it's quite obvious that you do what you do, you get organized and you struggle. But in post-Fordist system, you have a bunch of, like, everyone has different conditions, everyone has different contracts, everyone comes to a different time, and you don't even work in the same place. So how can you rebuild this fragmented space? The factories in France are the luckiest ones out of different reasons, because first of all, there is a totally different concept of work and of production in France. It's a very nationalist notion, but it's also about always saving national production and the value of work. So they had, it's one factory in close to Marseille that used to produce, it was a Unilever Lipton tea bag factory, and it was also bought by an external investor, and they were also producing a French brand, I don't know if you call it, you know it, the l'Elephant. It has an elephant, like an Indian style elephant on it, and it's from there. It was like that thing was bought then, like it's a 125-year-old brand, but it was bought by Unilever and Lipton, and it was bought then by another bigger investor who decided to move everything to Poland and just close down the plant near Marseille. So the workers occupied immediately, did not allow to take any machines away, and in the end they struggled for 1,347 days or something like that. I know more or less the number because it's the name now of the cooperative they have. It's called Co-op 1,347. It's the numbers of days they were on occupation. And did not allow that the machines were taken away, fought in the courts against the social plans that Unilever proposed, that fought down in the courts like 4 or 5 times the social plans that Unilever proposed, and had the support of the Communist Workers' Union, the CGT, and of the community, the municipality. And in the end, they reached an agreement where Unilever had to pay them, I don't know, 20 million euros or something, like in payments and in technical support and in machines and everything. They're now producing 16 different types of organic teas. Most of them are locally grown linen tea and others. And they work with a cooperative from Vietnam and import tea from Vietnam and sell organic cooperative tea from Vietnam. The other one is a former ice cream factory in 120 kilometers from Marseille that was also bought just by an international investor because they had the distribution network was to get into all the Hypercore, the huge supermarkets in France. And this investor just wanted to have his stuff into the Hypercore, so he bought the plant and closed it down just to use the brand and the contracts to get his own stuff into Hypercore. They also occupied immediately and did not take about any machines, had also a long struggle, not 4 years, like the bit less, 1.5 or something, but they're also producing now organic ice cream and organic yogurt that they're distributing regionally. So it's interesting that how when they have the chance and they get on the debate, most of them switch to some kind of organic recycling or something production. What is interesting, because usually we or society tends to say that like this question about organic and recycling, etc., it's like, yeah, it's a middle class thing, it's a bourgeois thing, and workers don't have neither time nor money to think about these things because they have to solve more important things in their life. But it's not true, because once these workers start having a say, start having a feeling that they can decide something that is relevant for society, they think about it and decide it. And the priorities become different when they have the chance to decide about these things. So, coming closely to an end, but what the interesting thing is that, like I said, it's more a production of new values, of new social relations, of new networks, and it can give you an idea of what could the new look like. And if we look at the history, it's very rare that these kind of worker-controlled business failed on their own. They were usually destroyed from the outside, intentionally, with a text that no capitalist has to fear usually. So you have everyone against you. It's not true that capitalism is only about money. The experience, for example, like of factories in Venezuela is that when they had private factories producing parts for them, they got intentionally parts with errors and failures and everything. Just they were intentionally sabotaged by the other capitalists. They get together to try to prevent you from buying. You have the problem that the former owner usually didn't obviously pay all the debts he had, so the ones that are bringing you the prime material to work with want to see the money from you before they bring you new materials. Maybe sometimes the machines are taken away or are old and obsolete. You have usually the union, most of the times, if it's not against you, it's ignoring you in the best case, because you're not anymore in their field. You're not a worker anymore. You're trying to be like, for example, Viome is constantly attacked by PAME, the communist union in Greece. I mean, the most Stalinist nerds you can imagine, but they continue to attack them and saying them that they don't support them because they want to be capitalists, because they want to have the factory under control. And it was even now that they did like a huge campaign, a caravan that would travel to Athens and try to pressure the government to have a solution. And the caravan was supported. There was caravans of struggles, like with the cleaners from the finance ministry and people from the Haldiki cement plant and a few others. And the Communist Party and PAME did a declaration where they explicitly supported all the struggles apart from Viome. And so, but that's often the experience. So you have everyone against you, and at the same time, I think it's important to stress that you need everyone. If you want to recuperate a company or a factory, you have to get in touch with authorities, and you will need their support at a certain point, because it's a political problem and it asks for a political solution, not just for a financial or juridical. Often there is the need of a political intervention. And there is also still a video of Tsipras before he was elected in Viome, where he's saying, "This factory belongs to the workers. We demand from the government that it hands over the factory to the workers immediately. These workers need all the support from the government." After he was elected, he didn't do anything. The government is not doing anything, and Viome is now facing auction. They are trying to auction the land where Viome is built on to supposedly pay off other former workers from a factory that belonged to the same owner. The first two auction dates could be disrupted by Viome, and it's anyway, they don't think that they will sell it immediately, and it's like, if they don't sell it for that price, then the court has to decide on a different price, and then it starts again with 4 auctions, etc. But this is now the situation of Viome, and Officina Zero in Italy faces a very similar situation where they're preparing the auction. So you need the support of authorities somehow. You need obviously this, or it's good to have the support of unions, obviously, to bring this thing. You need political connections, and you need some contact. I mean, you don't have to praise all parties, but you will have to have a contact and to get in touch with parties. So it's not something you can say they're all bad, I don't work with anyone and I'm not interested in, and I'm the purest revolutionary of all, because you need all these forces. And you have to handle them in a way that no one takes over your agenda, but that you still control, obviously, your agenda. That's one of the big difficulties. But at the same time, and I close with that, it's very, I think if we look at it, if we look at the numbers of the figures, for example, in Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay and other places where there's a consistent number of recuperated factories, we can see that the rate of economic failure of recuperated factories is much, much less than of any capitalist business. Obviously, because they don't have to bring in 40% of revenues every year to satisfy the owner so he doesn't put his money into the stock market. They find a solution if they have a problem in some way. That's also the difference to cooperatives. The great cooperative that is always an example, Mondragon in the Basque countries, which is a huge cooperative network, works exactly like any transnational companies. They can be a company, they can be a cooperative in the Basque countries because they have 117 companies internationally, from China to Romania, that are not cooperatives and produce for them. Now with the crisis, they closed down their biggest factory in the Basque countries and kicked out 1,200 workers that occupied the factories just to ask that the bankruptcy of this cooperative factory would not affect the rents, the pensions of workers that had put their pension money into the pension fund that was belonging to this factory of the cooperative. There's no workers' control in these cooperative factories at all. It's just a big conglomerate with a lot of people that can vote one director on in an assembly every year, and that's it. So it's a very problematic case, but there are also things to learn, I think, from Mondragon. Then there's two things they did in the network are things that we also need to do when we build better networks of recuperated factories. One is to have an own job education program and system, because it's not only the technical part, but it's also obviously certain values and other things you have to transmit. And second, to have an own financial system that can help to set up like further cooperatives and things. Like, for example, when we're thinking about the commodity chains, it also means that we have to think, okay, we have this prime material we need. Do we really have to buy it from some transnational producer, or is it maybe possible that we build a cooperative like in the community near to the factory and they do it for us, for example? Same thing for distribution and other things. So I think there are a lot of aspects that can be thought. One thing where we're thinking about these things is the so-called encounters of workers' economy that have been started in Latin America years ago, and every 2 years there's a regional Latin American meeting. Now they had already 8, and there's a worldwide meeting that took place now for the 5th time was in Venezuela this year. And we started with European meetings. The next one is going to be the 2nd. It's going to be next March in Thessaloniki. So we want to do it in Viome, also to support and defend Viome. And it's usually a gathering of people from different recuperated factories, from cooperatives that have the same logic of struggle and equality, from researchers working in the field, and we often also have then people workers coming from, and researchers from Latin America, and telling the experiences there. So if you look at the workers' control net site, you'll be aware when the meeting is, but it's going to be like probably second half of March in Thessaloniki.